Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's start with our second type of democratic government system. That is going to be a presidential democracy. Remember that there are three powers: the ability to make and enforce and interpret law. We have lawmaking bodies. Last time we learned about Parliament and the Prime Minister, who is the head of government in the executive branch. Of course, remember the executive branch's primary job is to enforce the law that is made by the legislative branch, and then you have the judicial branch, which is the independent courts. Okay. Now, our focus today is going to be on Congress or National Assembly if you're in Nigeria, and the president. And remember that last time we had the um, parliamentary systems, we had the voters who elect parliament. Parliament, the majority party chooses the prime minister. Then they also appoint the judicial branch, whatever that is, in the Supreme Court in the United Kingdom. Remember that the cabinet, it is actually made up of members of the parliament, the legislative branch, the MPs, and those are the MPs that advise the prime minister. The prime minister basically can get removed pretty quickly with a vote of no confidence or a party leadership vote. Now our focus is a presidential system. The presidential system has a different way the voters interact. They vote independently in elections for the legislative branch and the executive branch, or in this case, in Mexico and the United States, it would be the Congress. In Nigeria, it would be the National Assembly. And of course, on the executive side, you have the president. Then they both get together. The executive nominates, the legislative approves, the judicial branch, the Supreme Courts of Mexico and Nigeria, and of course the United States. Now, you'll find the presidential system. You have the Russian hybrid that we've already talked about, but you'll find this system in uh, Nigeria and Mexico. In both circumstances, the legislative branch has two houses. In Nigeria, that has the Senate and the House of Representatives. Whoa, just like the United States. That is correct. In Mexico, they have the Mexican Senate, and the Chamber of Deputies is the lower house. Um, cool name, by the way. Now, there is a cabinet, of course, closest advisors to the president. That cabinet is made up of people that are totally independent of any other branch of government. So the president doesn't have somebody working behind the scenes to possibly take over their job. Cabinet members are not members of, again, any branch of government. They serve at the pleasure of the president, and they, of course, lead the different executive functions that enforce laws that are being passed. There is a little bit of compromise, though, to get cabinet members that are not too radical, and that is that the president actually nominates members to be a part of the cabinet, and your legislative branch must approve members of the cabinet. So there has to be some kind of compromise there to get people that aren't going to be too far left or too far right, depending on who's in power in the presidency. This reminder that cabinet members have no other connection to the legislative branch. They are not members of Congress at all. Nigeria does have a little quirk, and the quirk is to because it is so an ethnically diverse country that there's a constitutional requirement that every member of cabinet be from one state. So there is one member of cabinet is from one different region of Nigeria. And this kind of helps bring that diversity to the cabinet. And it doesn't look like that all the president's decisions are being made without the input from every part of Nigeria. Now, how does a bill become a law? Well, it starts out as a bill, um, which is, of course, a proposal for a law. The legislative branch, it could be anybody in the legislative branch, either house can propose the bill and write it. The president cannot propose a bill. The president can recommend a bill and say, "Can you please write it?" But the president can't actually write the bill. The bill must pass both houses of Congress. Much more difficult in a presidential system to get bills passed because there has to be some sort of compromise. And unless a party runs the president and both houses of Congress, then guess what? It's going to take a slower amount of time because you have to come to an agreement. This is why within a presidential system you get something known as gridlock, where often you won't get anything that happens, and the process is really slow and nothing gets done, and people get really frustrated with presidential systems. But again, this is if opposing parties are running different houses of Congress and also the president. Speaking of the president can do two things to a bill. That is, either sign and it becomes a law, or they say no to a bill, which is known as a veto. And of course, if a president says no to a bill, it goes back to the legislative branch, where if it has been vetoed, they can do what's called a legislative override. This requires a supermajority, two-thirds of the vote in both houses of the legislative branch. If a bill is vetoed, it is gone. If it is overridden, then it succeeds and it automatically becomes a law. Veto overrides are very rare. They are very rare. Now, how do you check presidential power in this type of government? Well, the number one check is veto overrides. That you can, the president's getting pretty saucy there, um, flinging their vetoes all over the place. Well, then the legislators are the representatives of the people that were actually voted in a free and fair election. And so, if enough of them approve, two-thirds, veto override, the executive is checked and the bill becomes a law. Number two are your approvals. President nominates cabinet members, you can say no. President nominates a judicial court nominee, a justice of the Supreme Court, legislative branch can just say no, they don't approve. This is an example of checking the power so that people that are in these important institutions, especially in the judicial branch, independent judiciary, that they truly are kind of more moderate, middle of the road, that there's a compromise on who gets in power here. Finally, there's the process known as impeachment. Now, impeachment requires that a two-thirds vote in your upper house to actually remove a sitting president. Okay. Now, your upper house, of course, in Mexico, it's going to be the Mexican Senate. In Nigeria, it's going to be the Senate also. In the United States, it's the US Senate. So all three of those have the same names. And the process starts usually where articles of impeachment are written up by your lower house. They get passed by a simple majority. But officially, that doesn't mean that president is removed until you get two-thirds of a vote in the upper house of your legislative branch. The other difference with an impeachment as opposed to some other, like a vote of no confidence, is there usually has to be some kind of crime that has happened where the president has broken the Constitution. And so, and not a simple, we're not talking about like speeding tickets or something like that. There actually needs to be a crime that we look at inside the Constitution, where it says the president has committed a high crime or misdemeanor, and that can get them removed from power. Again, two-thirds of a vote in your upper house is very, very, very difficult to achieve. So the removal of the chief executive through impeachment is a long, arduous, and very, very difficult process. So if they're going to get removed, they really have to get removed for a legitimate reason. But a note, the legislative actually has power to impeach more than just the president. The, the legislative branch can actually impeach court justices on, so your Supreme Court justices, your federal court justices, or members of the president's cabinet that act inappropriately. So there is actually quite a bit of power by the legislative branch. If they want to remove other parts of government, they can. It's just really, really difficult. Two-thirds of vote in an upper house is hard to do. Okay, so we have our voters in independent elections elect the executive and legislative. Of course, the cabinet and the courts are nominated by the executive and approved by the legislative. You have checks, which of course you cannot approve those nominees. You have veto overrides to pass bills. And of course, you have the removing the president from power through the process of impeachment.